So welcome to the Media Services Worldwide podcast. This episode, we've got a fantastic guest. We've got New Jersey native Steve Nigohosian. Now, Steve, did I pronounce that okay?
You most certainly did.
Excellent. Well, look, welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So just a little background before we get into a full conversation. Steven began as an avid drummer and guitarist, fed his passion for music by joining a cover band and playing various gigs in New York City and throughout northern New Jersey. Today, Steve manages his own marketing, communications, and public relations consulting practice, and his breadth of experience just spans from, the music industry to working with some premier influencers, names like, Tito Puente, Phil Collins, Elton John, Carlos Santana. So I think, Steve, we're so happy to have you on our show, on our podcast today, Steve, because I think what you'll do is bring such a breadth of knowledge and experience as to, what should we be looking at towards the future? What has your experience, taught you as far as how to navigate these creative waters that we're in right now, as far as messaging and content and also innovation. So, Stephen, thank you again for being a part of this. And let's just jump right into it. So I know I touched on your background a little bit, but I think there's no one better to kind of break down who you are than you.
That is true. Well, thanks for having me again. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. And I've often been asked, how would you describe yourself when it comes to your professional career? And the first thing that comes to mind is I consider myself a chameleon. It might sound a little strange, but my reason for that is because I've been able to walk both sides of the music industry and the corporate side of things, which isn't something that a lot of people in the businesses that have been able to navigate easily. When I first started out of college with a degree in public relations, I had worked at several PR firms and marketing firms in New York City and New Jersey, and I got an understanding of what it's like to work in a corporate environment. You're held accountable for your work, and you have to be organized, and you have to put client service first. And after doing that for about 8 years, when I made the lateral move into the music instrument business, working for a company called Latin Percussion, which manufactured drums, particularly the drums used in Latin music and cowbells used on drum kits in rock bands and things of that nature, I got a real taste of the artist side of things. So whenever I worked in an environment like that, my boss used to refer to me as the chameleon. He liked the fact that I could, generate reports and get him up to speed as far as how things were going, as far as the artist relations department that I ran. But he also liked the fact that I could go out to gigs and meet with the artists and sort of walk the walk and talk the talk and make them feel comfortable, because in my experience, the surest way to scare off a musician or an artist is to walk in with a suit, a suit on and a tie, and so I was able to walk both lines. So I've been very, very fortunate in my career for, number one, being able to work for some marquee names like Latin Percussion and Fender Guitar Company, but number two, being able to really work with some great artistic and creative people. So that's something I'm very thankful for.
And we appreciate you giving us that background. And I wanted to make sure we mention, too, we also have Garry Darvin on the phone, CEO of Media Services Worldwide. And, Garry at times is in the background. He's kind of operating the big picture. But I thought it was critical to mention him early at the onset, because you and Garry have an interesting history, right? There's a relationship that dates back some time. I'll let you kind of touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Garry and I were fortunate enough to grow up in northern New Jersey in Bergen County in a town called Hallworth, which is, I'd say, about 14 or 15 miles from New York City. So even though we lived in the metro New York City area, and I'm sure Garry will also echo these sentiments. We were really fortunate to be able to grow up in Haworth, which was a town where I think at the time, Garry, there was probably about maybe 3,500 people total living in the town.
Yeah, that's about right.
And everyone pretty much knew each other. We had a small elementary school, Haworth Public School, of which, as I've mentioned before, Garry was way ahead of his time. He was a man ahead of his time there as far as his audiovisual skills. And as I mentioned to him, one of the fond memories I have of him was in our elementary school library. He was the go-to guy that we would all call. Like, this is back when we had film projectors, and I think cutting edge technology back in that day was the definition of cutting edge technology was basically those old overhead projectors where you'd have that clear plastic sheet and you'd write on it in those erasable magic markers, and the teacher would project it onto a screen. Well, Garry was a guy we'd call. Teachers will all call whenever something didn't work right or it broke, and he'd come in and he'd get it up and running within about 2 minutes. So that was both a blessing and a curse because thanks to Garry, we were able to further our education, but no thanks to Garry, we weren't able to goof around for the rest of class because the projector was down. So it was a good thing that Garry was such a well-liked guy among our peers. But so long story short, we grew up in Haworth, and it was just really, really great environment to grow up in. People, the old saying where you could leave your door open at night, not worry about, and getting robbed or anything like that. Played kickball in the street during the day and Little League baseball. And it was just had a really small little business district with like 5 stores, right, Garry? I think we had the Haworth Pizza and the dry cleaners and maybe 1 or 2 other
the
stores.
The
hardware store, which is still going strong. I think he's the only one to actually beat out Home Depot and Lowe's and still survive. But
right, shout out to Bob. He's still around.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really fortunate to grow up in that environment, and Garry and I have had the conversation previously that it really shaped who we are as adults now. How we approach our professional life and how we approach our interpersonal skills with other people, whether it's a client or friends or family. It's just, you just tend to really be very down to earth when you grow up in an environment like that, and very accessible and very personable. And so we were fortunate to be able to have that kind of upbringing.
I love that. And I'm glad that the two of you could connect and do so right here on the podcast, because I think more than ever, right, a sense of history and relationship and a sense of community and understanding the value of business and the messaging behind it is more important right now as things are changing and have changed in the marketplace for brands and businesses. And, Steve, that's one of the many things that you bring to the table. I mean, with your background, having your PS and Mass Communication from Boston University, working at PR firms, and really understanding client relations. I think this uniquely positions you on our podcast to speak to our listeners with insight, not simply as this, big corporate, suit and tie, but like you said, as a chameleon, who's able to adapt to their environment, change, work diversely, but always with this, singular, thought in mind. And communication right now, I think, is a challenge for many. So let me get right into it and just ask you, based on some of your experience, how important is it today for a brand to really consider their messaging and communication to the marketplace? And you could touch on the current situation that the world is facing as well.
Well, it's extremely important for many reasons, in my opinion. Number one, you have to have a distinct brand identity to stand out from your competitors or from the crowd. And that's a really broad-based term, in my opinion, for a few different things. Brand identity, to me, consists of, number one, great customer service, regardless of what industry you're in. So, for instance, in my experience in the music instrument business, one of the things that I was told time and time again by the professional musicians that I'd service and work with was the fact that they really appreciated that they would get a call back from me almost immediately, which, when they're on the road and they're touring and, one of their drums gets misplaced, in shipping, from gig to gig, or when they're working a session and the producer says, he's looking for a certain sounding instrument, and they'll call me and say, hey, can you get this to me by tomorrow? Getting the product to them right away, or just picking up the phone and having a relationship with them, not just a business relationship, but a friendship with them is really, really important. So, that was part of the brand identity that we enjoyed at Latin Percussion when I worked there, and that's what they were known for at the time, was really great customer service. The other thing is, as far as having your messaging, it has to be consistent. Especially today, as you just mentioned, Trevor, technology is just growing and by leaps and bounds, and we have so many new what I call methods of transportation for your message. So, when I first started out, there was no social media. There was email was just real primitive as far as email that we used at work, and the internet was just very, very basic. Now you have all these choices and all these vehicles for delivering your message, and it's really easy, if you're not careful, to send either messages that aren't consistent with each other, or messages that are not strategically thought out. So, in other words, your advertising message, your social media message, if you're doing if you have an e-newsletter, for instance, the messaging in that, the messaging on your website, those all have to be consistent. One thing I think that's important is not confusing consistency with sameness. You don't want the message to be exactly the same across all those. You want the basic message to be the same, because obviously, you take social media, for instance. Each one of the social media platforms available to us, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, they all have, or LinkedIn also, which I think tends to be overlooked sometimes by businesses. They all have a different voice to them. So by tailoring that basic message to each of those different platforms, you can really speak to your audience. You can speak to your consumers and your clients in a language that they'll understand. When someone looks down their LinkedIn feed and is looking for information, they're not going to expect to see someone playing with their puppy out in the front yard, having it do tricks. Obviously, Instagram or Facebook, would be something that's more appropriate for that. So you really got to know your messaging, and you have to know the vehicle that you're using to deliver it really well.
And I think you definitely have the credibility to make that statement, because you spend a lot of time in the music industry, and that's obviously a passion of yours. So I'd like for you to touch on that a little bit. Your passion in the music industry, and then how that correlated to the statement you just made. Right? You have to really have a passion for it and immerse yourself in it, and how you were able to turn what you love into not only working for some premier, companies in the music business, but how you were able to then aid with their messaging and grow their brand and sphere of influence. If you could just talk about that for a little bit, I think that'd be very interesting to hear.
Sure, absolutely. Well, my passion for music started when I was very small. I mean, I think as far back as I can remember, being around 5 or 6 years old, my parents always had music playing in the house. They had an old hi-fi stereo system, and there were always different kinds of records on. My mom was a big fan of Frank Sinatra and Johnny Mathis, and my dad loved classical music and Armenian ethnic music. So I really was lucky to have a real exposure to different genres of music. And then as I got older, I started coming into my own as far as my own musical taste and choices. And I really got involved in bands that had really great drummers. So I became, like a Genesis fan. And then as I got older, a Rush fan. And, it just really ignited this passion inside of me for music and musical instruments. So after I graduated from college, when I was working at a public relations firm, I didn't have any music clients, and although I enjoyed doing consumer public relations, for consumer companies, consumer products types of clients, there was a part of me that really missed the music side of it. So I started writing for a publication called Modern Drummer Magazine, which was like the only drumming magazine, nationwide magazine that there was. And I pitched them on a story about a drummer who I had taken lessons from in Haworth. Garry will know who this is. His name is Ron Zito. And Ronnie Zito played with Peggy Lee and also did a lot of the award shows like the Oscars and the Grammys on TV. He was always in the orchestra or the house band. So I started taking drumming lessons from him, and I pitched Modern Drummer on the article, and they said, sure, write it. So I wrote it, and when they bought the article, I thought, wow, this is a really cool way to make money. I mean, I can actually, make some money doing something I love, which is talking with musicians and drummers. Well, fast forward, a year later, Latin Percussion had contacted the editors of Modern Drummer Magazine because they were looking for someone to write their catalog copy. And I was recommended to do that. So I started working freelance on the side for LP, for Latin Percussion. And after about a month or two, the position for an artist relations manager opened up at LP. Artist relations, for those who haven't heard the term, it's basically the same thing as being a brand ambassador manager. You work as the liaison between the people that endorse your product and the company. And because I had a public relations background, they broadened the position to artist relations and public relations. So I ended up doing that. And that's where I learned, as your question, the question you posed, Trevor, I learned that tailoring your message to different audiences is really critical. So when I was working at Latin Percussion, we had endorsers in many different genres of music. There was rock, there was pop, jazz, classical percussion, world music. And the message that we would send out about our products to each of those groups of musicians or consumers who played that type of music would not be the same music, because, a rock drummer is not going to always use the same exact instruments that a world musician would use or a hand drummer would use. So that's where I really started learning that it's really important to hone your message to a fine point to really speak to the audience that you're trying to reach. And even today, I do the same thing. With my consulting business, doing public relations and marketing communications, I have different clients. I have one in real estate. I have one who works for the diocese of a large nationwide church organization. I have one that makes consumer products. And you have to tailor the message that you're sending out for that client to their specific audience, and it's really critical. Otherwise, what happens is you're going to get buried. Basically, your competitors are going to be able to get the publicity and the sales and the clients that you won't be able to because you didn't speak in terms of that very fine message to a specific audience.
So, you're talking depth. You took your passion, you built it into something that allowed you to create messaging to get in between the artist and the company that the artist, was representing, with their product. And you've done that, and you did that, and I'm sure there were challenges with it, but let's just kind of address the current situation. So we almost don't want to use the word. We don't want to have the negative connotation, but currently, for any of our listeners who pull this podcast up, a year from now or so, and say, really try to understand the context of it. Right now, we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's really slowed businesses down, and it's really got businesses paused and thinking. And they're thinking about the future and the present, right? And how the present is going to impact their future and what they need to do in the present to then build out their organizations for the future. So that's whether they're, large enterprise, small, medium businesses, or the individual entrepreneur. Now, what would you say would be something that they, would need to do right now with their messaging? How does a company address branding, influence, and their communication in the face of a global crisis what would your suggestions be? If you could speak to these as your potential clients and your clients, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think the first thing, which is very important, is to stay on people's radar. So I would tell a client or I would tell a company, yes, things have slowed down, but we need to work together to create messaging that you can continue to put out in front of the public and to your audience or your demographic to let them know, guess what, folks, we're still here. We're still going strong. This is a temporary setback for everyone, this COVID outbreak, but we are shoring things up and we are prepared for when this calms down to still go full throttle. And we're not going anywhere. We are not disappearing. We're still strong. One of the ways they can do that is to think of ways of creating messaging that are appropriate for this current time of the COVID crisis. I know you and I had a conversation, Trevor, about the travel industry, about how it's really important. You brought this up, and it was an extremely good point, how the travel industry needs to use this time to, for instance, talk about the amenities or the services that their particular resort offers. So when we get the green light from the CDC and from our government saying, okay, folks, it's all right to start easing back into travel and start easing back into our lifestyle at a slower rate, that people will remember that these resorts do exist, and they'll remember all the amenities that were messaged to them during the COVID crisis, and they'll probably be more inclined to say, you know what, I think I am going to take that trip now with my family, or I am going to go to this particular resort, or I am going to go to this particular hotel, because of the messaging that really stuck in their heads during the COVID crisis. I think along those lines, what's important too is to have several different touch points. You have to, I think some statistics have shown, like, you have to touch your consumer through messaging or your demographic through messaging anywhere from 8 to maybe 12 times before it really, really sinks in and they really make a decision to say, okay, I'm going to buy that product, or, I'm going to take that trip and go to that resort. So this is the perfect time to continue with that messaging and to have multiple touch points to your audience. Those are definitely things that I would suggest that clients do right now, because that also reinforces your branding. That messaging during this quote unquote downtime reinforces your communication to them, and it reinforces your influence to them. And this is a great time to do it.
And you know what? I love how you just, wrap that up, right? This is a great time to do it. And I think a lot of companies are missing that right now. I honestly do. I know that, initially this puts, organizations on their heels, right? What are we really going to be able to do at this point? How do we get through this? But what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is see this as an opportunity to reinforce the strength of your brand. Am I correct in saying that?
100% correct. This is the perfect time to do that. One thing that comes to mind is, people have a lot of downtime right now. I mean, they're working from home, but they're looking for something to take a break from work. So they're probably scrolling through their phone, through their social media. So I would hope that clients have, Instagram and other, Facebook accounts where they can really start posting, really ramp up their amount of content and posting. So when people take a break, for instance, from working at home, they look through that. People right now, I think, are looking for an escape from this really unprecedented and trying situation that we're faced with. I mean, a lot of us are not used to being home, working from home like this. And, it presents a whole new amount of challenges for people. Everything from they don't have all of the tools or amenities that they usually have at their office. It's not available to them at home, or perhaps they have young children at home, so getting that moment of peace and quiet to be able to do your work, your profession, is really hard. So I think, like you said, this is definitely the right time to be sending that messaging out, because for lack of a better term, you kind of have a captive audience. I mean, a willing captive audience. They're willing to look for an escape and look through their social media or read through that that e-newsletter that might have gotten buried in their inbox back when they were getting tons and tons of emails, during normal situations. Now maybe they'll look at that as a way of escaping the situation right now that's really challenging to them, and they'll embrace the content that's in there. So yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. This is the right time.
And Steve, that's how we really reconnected, was through social media.
Absolutely, and I was going to mention that too, Garry. Trevor, when you asked me before about the town Garry and I grew up in, one thing I also want to mention is Garry and I were able to reconnect just about a month or two ago on LinkedIn, and it was like no time had passed. I mean, we had not seen or spoken to each other, just for the fact that, we moved away, we all went to college, things like that. But, growing up in a town like Hallworth, where you knew everyone who lived there and everyone was friends with each other and friendly. Garry and I picked up 2 months ago, like no time had passed at all. And so that's another beauty of social media, not just the messaging, but the fact that it builds relationships, or it can reinstate relationships, whether it's for business or just for social aspect, relationships that you had many years ago. And that's exactly what happened with Garry and I. So, relationships are a big part also of business as well, and that are really helped by social media. I'm not saying you have to do the hard sell all the time as far as, putting, your product advertising or your services on social media all the time. Look, just reaching out to people like I've been doing, this COVID situation where everyone's cooped up. I know a lot of people are, cooped up in their homes, and they're looking to video conferencing apps like Zoom and Skype to reconnect with people. And I've actually done a few of those in the past couple of weeks during this whole COVID situation. My friends and I miss seeing each other, so we get on a group video call. Everyone grabs a drink, and at least you can stay in touch with people. Because as you mentioned, Trevor, once this situation calms down a bit with the COVID quarantines, those relationships that you maintain through the quarantine could bear fruit for business purposes, or at the very least, there'll be social relationships that you've rekindled. And once we're able to go out into a restaurant and meet up with people again, and it's safe to do so, you're going to have already laid the groundwork to do that through the social media. So that's important too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny, how relationships can be fostered, rekindled, and even take on, a new life, right? Because we're all in a different position right now. So the timing, I always say, it's not that we're missing an opportunity or that the opportunity wasn't right. I would say that 90% of the time, it's just a matter of timing. So when you take a pause like this and an opportunity like this and look at it as a reason to reach out, as you've done, as you and Garry did and connected, I think it's perfect. I think it's a great example of what we can do. Now, Steve, I'd be remiss if we didn't ask you to give us I would say a little bit of a story. And you've had the unique and awesome opportunity to work with some fantastic artists. As an artist relations director, any good stories. I think a lot of times people want to know some personality, of these individuals that meet. How do these influencers, are they really just involved in the brand, or do they believe in the product, or are they selling a bill of goods, and are they genuine when they're doing it? Do you have any good stories about, somebody that just really, impressed you and blew you away?
Yeah, absolutely. Having been in artist relations and brand ambassador relations for almost 20 years, I did have the opportunity to meet a lot of marquee names in the music industry. And I have to be honest with you, I never was starstruck, I'd say maybe 80% of the time. But that other 20%, I would be starstruck when it was meeting someone who had influenced my drumming or my love for music or whatever aspect in life that they had influenced. And the name that immediately pops in my head is Phil Collins. Phil Collins was the reason that I started playing drums. My brother, back when I was, must have been 11 or 12 years old, back in 1981, my brother brought a cassette tape. I'm sure some of us will remember what a cassette tape was, but that he brought home the Genesis album Abacab on cassette. And I remember hearing him play it, and I was just something about it grabbed me. And so I looked into the band more. I got to know who the members were. I got to listen to their music more. I started listening to more of their albums. And then, seeing Phil Collins singing and drumming at the same time, which is a lot harder than most people give credit for. It's not easy because you're not playing along with the melody like you are on when you're a guitar player. It's much harder on drums. I was just so impressed with the way Phil was able to pull that off, not to mention being a songwriter and a great music producer as well. So when I got the phone call from Phil Collins' drum tech while I was the artist relations manager over at Latin Percussion, telling me that he had gotten my name from another musician and that Phil needed a couple of cowbells for his drum set, and he wanted to know if I would like to hand deliver those drum set to Studio Instrument Rentals, also known as SIR, in New York City, where most of the major bands will rehearse when they're rehearsing for a tour. I almost fell out of my chair, and boy, did I get butterflies in my stomach because I said, oh my goodness, I'm going to actually get a chance to talk to and meet the person that really inspired me musically and otherwise. So I packed up the cowbells and I went to SIR in Manhattan, and his drum tech met me at the door, very nice guy, Steve Jones, and he brought me into the rehearsal area where Phil and the rest of Genesis were rehearsing, and they were just kind of hanging out. They were taking a break, and he brought me over to Phil, and at that moment I said, boy, I hope Phil's a nice guy, because if he isn't, it's just going to ruin it for me. And he ended up being the nicest, most appreciative guy when just for delivering those cowbells and for supporting the band with our instruments whenever they needed it. Whenever the drum tech would call, we would always make sure we delivered what they needed. And so to answer your question, and Phil was someone who always waved the Latin Percussion flag for us. I mean, when he did VH1 Storytellers, he made sure one of our conga drums was front and center on the camera. And so there were definitely professional musicians who really appreciated the work that you did for them, and they made sure that they waved the flag and they believed in the product that they endorsed. And that led to other artists too. I had the opportunity to meet Elton John when he was doing the Las Vegas run, the Red Piano it was called. He ended up being a very nice guy, and so that was the really fulfilling part of the job. Now, it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. There's definitely professional musicians, just as there are in every industry, who are very difficult, who want something right away and expect it and maybe don't necessarily show the amount of appreciation that other artists show. But that comes with the territory, and I think that just like with any position, any job that you have in any industry, you have to take those rough kinds of situations and learn from them. Sometimes it creates a scar, but those scars are something that will remind you of the fact that you got through a tough situation. So I think that's important to have both sides of it as well. But I'd say overall, my experience in public relations and marketing communications and brand ambassador relations has really been a positive one. And I've been very fortunate to work with some really great professional people who, appreciate the brand that they endorse. And in the case of LP, the people that I worked with there, we just had such a love of music and such a pride of the brand back in, the late 1990s through around 2014. That group that ran the company at that point really had a passion for it, and it's contagious. And you really, when you work with people who really like what they do and take pride in the work that they do, it's contagious, and you want to do the same thing, if not more.
And you know what? And you've worked with a breadth of, like you said, marquee names, and I think that is tremendous. And, Steve, I want to just thank you for taking the time, to come onto the podcast, to share your insights. I think it's critical that whether we're in a current pandemic or just we're in the normal day-to-day operations of business, messaging and communication, artist relations, PR, this is something that will never go away and will always evolve. And we require absolutely amazing storytellers like yourself to lead the way. And we appreciate the insight that you brought to the table, to the discussion today, the background on Garry and his early AV days, which is tremendous. I can't thank you about more. There's a picture floating around that we can't show you at this point, but when we have you back on the show, I think people will need to see young Garry working was it a VHS or Betamax, Garry?
It was a Betamax back in the day.
It was about the size of a small Volkswagen, that Betamax back then.
And the day we got that in the school and switched from 3/4 inch reel to reel tape to a Betamax was a big day at Haworth Public School.
I'll bet, yeah.
Wow. I mean,
if I can leave you with one thing, Trevor and Garry, I will say that along the lines of what you just said, the vehicle for the messaging may change, but the core message should not change. And that is, client service and getting your point across and knowing your audience and tailoring your message to the audience. So, back in the day, when messaging went out by US mail or then went out by email, now it goes out through social media. The vehicle for delivering the messaging has changed, but the message should not change. It should always be very distinct and very tailored to the audience.
I mean, I think that's a great note, to leave the audience with. But one last thing I want you to do, Steve, because today, again, as I mentioned at the onset of this conversation, Steve manages his own marketing, communications, and PR consulting practice. His clients include real estate professionals, law firms, consumer products manufacturers, and of course, with his background, musical performance and the arts. So, Steve, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, speak to you, get some advice, how can they reach you?
I would say the best way to reach me is either by email, where they can reach me at Steve, STEVE, .Nigohosian, which is N as in Nancy, IGOHOS as in Stephen, IAN as in Nancy, at gmail.com. Or they can always reach me on my mobile office line, which is 201-370-5989, and I'd be happy to speak to them.
I think that's phenomenal. And from somebody who's had a great conversation, with Steve prior to this podcast, I mean, we haven't even touched on the stories and the breadth of information that he brings to the table. So reach out, have a conversation. It's absolutely worth, speaking with Steve. And Steve, I really can't thank you enough on behalf of the entire Media Services Worldwide team and the Media Services Worldwide podcast listeners. Thank you for joining us, for sharing your insights, and we wish you the greatest of success. We look forward to having an opportunity to work with you as well. And we know the future is going to be bright, and it's individuals with the insight and foresight, just like you, who will lead the way, holding the light for us all. So thank you, and we look forward to our next chat. Take care, everybody.